Welcome back to 2.5 Hours. I'm Brian Becker. 5 years into the deepest economic recession since the 1930s, 10 years into the longest war in U.S. history, the war in Afghanistan, we're here to talk about domestic and foreign policy in the run-up to the 2012 election. I'm joined in this episode by Michael Lane. He's the Intelligence Strategies. John Berlau, he's the Center for Competitive Enterprise Institute. Ali Ahmed, the Gulf Council. Welcome. Let's start with Afghanistan, Michael. Of course, the horrible, destructive killing of Afghan civilians in the last 2 weeks has embroiled Afghanistan as a country, but U.S. foreign policy generally in a relook at what's going on in Afghanistan. Is this a tipping point in the war?
It very well may be, Brian. We don't know yet. Certainly, at this point, in the immediate aftermath of this tragic occurrence, we have the president, the Obama administration, holding to the party line, which is that we need to stay the course and stick with the plan, continue to train the Vietnamese security forces so that they can take. Afghan. I'm in the wrong order. Afghan security forces so that they can take over. There might be one. But there is a lot of call on both sides domestically in the United States from both the liberal left and the conservative right that perhaps our role in Afghanistan has played out and we ought to look at expediting our withdrawal under whatever terms and conditions we can negotiate with the Afghan government. It remains unclear as to how this is going to play.
Well, John, let me just ask you. You're someone who focuses on the economic issues in particular, but we're spending $120 billion, when I say we, the United States government, on a war in Afghanistan, a war that seems to go on and on and on. Major General John Allen from the Marines testified before Congress recently that even though combat troops are supposed to leave in 2014, the U.S. military at least sees a period of protracted engagement for U.S. combat forces or military bases in Afghanistan. Does the United States have the wherewithal, the economic basis to continue this occupation?
Well, Brian, as you said, my think tank, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, focuses mostly on domestic issues, so we don't really have a position on a lot of the foreign policy concerns. But yeah, I mean, I think yes. I mean, wars do cost money. That's money that could be used for either more spending if you think that's desirable, or even things like a corporate tax cut, things that I might think are desirable. And you are getting, Mike is right, concerns from liberals as well as on the right and among some Republicans like Ron Paul in the House and his son Rand, who's running for president, and his son Rand Paul in the Senate. So I really think there needs to be a clarification of what exactly the mission is there now that Bin Laden is dead. Now that, I mean, in many ways, it is a self-governing country. What is the justification for our presence? And our government seems to be a little foggy there.
Ali, you of course know a great deal about economics, but also, as with the Gulf Council, have expertise on the Middle East, certainly on that region of the world. What's going on inside of Afghanistan? I mean, here you have the Koran burnings a month ago. They noticed that there's a killing of 16 civilians, 9 of whom were children. Not a rare incident, in fact, something that may be quite routine. What's Afghan public opinion like, and is that a major factor in the calculations of the U.S.?
It is a major factor. It is what happened either with the burning of the Quran or this killing really exposes one major issue that not a lot of people have talked about, is that the United States forces or the United States policy and ability to learn much after 10 years of being in Afghanistan. So they did not learn that burning Quran might start a problem. Why did they do it? If they knew it was going to create a problem, why did they do it? Or did they not even realize this is going to be a huge issue? Or killing civilians. Yes, the person acted and maybe on his own, but the killing of civilians has been really a story from the beginning of the war. And the U.S. did not put any measures to reduce such incidents. So 10 years later, you are seeing there is a systematic problem within the U.S. military forces, that their inability to learn from how to build a country, for just training the Afghan soldiers, for example. 10 years is more than enough to train enough soldiers in that country, spending $120 billion. If I was in that position, instead of spending $220 billion a month or a year in that country, half of that money could be spent and given to Afghanistan in aid to build a stable country without the need of a single soldier.
That seems like a rational and logical argument, but here we have incident after incident after incident where there's atrocities against civilians, atrocities against Islam. The U.S. is becoming very expert in apologizing. It's time and time again, but the incidents don't stop. Is there something organic, inherent about the occupation that has the occupation force sort of reduce the indigenous population to sort of a category, treating them in a racist way or in a subhuman way? In other words, why this kind of mindless atrocity against the people that the United States is there purportedly to help liberate?
I think there is a part of it that the United States, these civilians who were killed in that country, even by mistake, let's assume it was a mistake. This latest incident definitely was not the policy of the United States, but it was an act of one single soldier. How can you remedy the situation? If this situation was done in this country, are you going to just say, oh, we're sorry? This is not going to be enough. You have to at least compensate the families of those victims in an appropriate manner. You don't give them $20 and say, that's it, that's all you get. And that has been the problem when it comes to civilian casualties. They should be compensated in a sufficient manner for those who were killed.
Michael, I want to come back to you. There's two possible scenarios to explain why the U.S. continues the trudge on in Afghanistan. It's not because of al-Qaeda. Leon Panetta, when he was director of CIA before he became defense secretary, testified in Congress that there were less than 100 al-Qaeda, maybe less than 50 in all of Afghanistan. U.S. spends $120 billion a year. It's 11 years into the war. President Obama tripled the number of troops in Afghanistan, the U.S. troops to 100,000. Scenario one, the U.S. is fighting so as to avoid the perception of having been defeated by an armed insurgency in a third world country. Or two, that the U.S. really has a grander design on establishing permanent JSOC, Joint Special Operation Command, bases in Afghanistan or other bases to control this resource-rich, geostrategically important region of the world. Do you think either of those are credible?
Not only are they both credible, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. And I think there are probably other reasons as well for going on there. I will take the president at his word that he got us in there because he was concerned about the vacuum of power that would happen if we were to have vacated before the Afghan internal security forces were strong enough to defend themselves. The Karzai government, presumably under his scenario, would have fallen. The Taliban would have reconstituted themselves, and they would have invited al-Qaeda back into Afghanistan to have their operation planning and training bases. Well, the president wanted to stop that. I take him at his word. But now that we are 3 years hence and facing circumstances that are very, very different and very, very unsettling, you wonder, okay, what are we still fighting about? Are we still looking for preventing the Taliban from coming back, making the security forces strong enough? I believe that's a part of it. I also believe that we do want permanent bases, be they overt or covert, in that region. And I also believe that there's a strong incentive on the part of the United States not to be seen as being not victorious over a ragtag insurgency in a third world country. It's just not the image we want projected out there.
Well,
there are other things too.
The U.S. has 900 or so military bases spread out around the world, maybe in 130 countries. The last time the United States was invaded, the mainland, was the War of 1812. That was a long time ago, 2 centuries ago. What's the purpose of bases in Afghanistan?
Listening and launching operations, mostly listening. You can really eavesdrop very well on that portion of the world that you want to. We'd have an easier time listening on Russia, easier time listening on many of the Middle East states. That's the primary thing. If we have air bases there, of course, launching reconnaissance aircraft and things like that. I mean, it's a wonderful thing. Also, a base from which to launch special operations if it came to that. I think that'd probably be the lesser of it. Intelligence is really the key part of it.
So John Berlau, Michael says there's a big intelligence operation that can be based permanently in Afghanistan, spying on people. Let me ask you about the economics of it. Is this a region of the world, either because of natural gas or because of its geostrategic or geographic location in regard to the transport of resources, oil pipelines, et cetera, that give it sort of a premium for the U.S. government? In other words, is the U.S. government partly looking out for corporate interests, far-flung corporate interests in that part of the world?
As Michael said, I think there are probably a variety of reasons. I mean, to be fair, when you said there was no on-land invasion, a lot of people, I mean, did consider the 9/11 attacks, and Al Qaeda then had its base in Afghanistan, you know, on the World Trade Center of the Pentagon as on-land invasions in the heart of the country. And the irony is
attack, but it wasn't an army invading the United States.
In a way, it was scarier than that. The irony is there was a lot less division. I think all except one member of Congress authorized us to go into Afghanistan. And there was more division on Iraq, which seems to be going better, and we are winding down there. And in a way, that's sort of been the curse, because Iraq, you know, it's sort of, you know, because of the division, it forced us to get focused. And Afghanistan, it's just sort of been let linger, and sort of we've lost focus on what the mission might be, or whether we should still be there.
Let me ask you, though, in the context of Iraq, here we have the old Ba'athist government is gone. Like it or loathe it, you can see definite structural changes in the economic way Iraq is organized. For instance, in the old Ba'athist constitution, foreign oil companies couldn't be owning parts of the Iraqi oil fields. Today, ExxonMobil is the biggest possessor of Iraqi oil installations. In other words, there was an economics to the invasion. There's a lot of Western corporations, principally U.S. corporations, that now have a big foothold in a very oil-rich part of the Middle East.
Well, I mean, I think in general that's good policy for a country to be open, like in this country. I'm against some of the retaliatory trade. Some of the, you know, trade sanctions we want to put on China. I think countries should be open to trade and investment. And so whether that came from the war or not, I mean, I think that's a good policy. And I know, you know, Hernando de Soto, other development economists have been in Iraq and Afghanistan as far as policies, as far as, you know, property rights and land titling. So, I mean, I guess all I can say is that's a good thing.
I'd have to question the formulation about that as a free trade. It's sort of blowing open new markets through invasions and bombings and occupations. But Ali, let me ask you the same question. What's the economics, if there are economics that are driving the U.S. policy either in Iraq or in Afghanistan, or is it not economics? Is it really not war for oil or positioning for U.S. business, U.S. corporations? Is it strictly a military calculation?
Well, like Mike said earlier, I don't think they are mutually exclusive. There are several goals. One of them is the U.S. At the time of Bush, during his administration, and as a reaction for the tragic events of 9/11, obviously Afghanistan had to be invaded, because otherwise the U.S. population would see the U.S. government as weak. So since then, the mission has changed, and Afghanistan is not where Al-Qaeda is today. And it is ridiculous, really, that the U.S. has spent over $1 trillion fighting Al-Qaeda. I mean, this country has probably spent more than that on fighting less than 3,000 people who do not have more than machine guns and bombs. And this is ridiculous economically. Economically, it's ridiculous. If you want, well, you can set up 3,000 men strong force to fight Al-Qaeda, not spend over $1 trillion to do that with limited success. The U.S. is in Afghanistan for several reasons. Strategic reasons. They don't need to be in Afghanistan to listen on Russia or Iran. They can use satellites for that. But they wanted to be there because they launched special ops into Russia, into China, and Iran. This is a corner where Afghanistan is bordered by China, Russia, and Iran. So these are three countries that the U.S. must have an advanced base to combat the influence, not militarily necessarily, but geopolitically. And of course, there is no escaping the fact that there is an interest for the companies like ExxonMobil and for the military-industrial complex that is benefiting through contracts. Contractors in Afghanistan probably soak up more money than actual American soldiers.
That's an interesting concept. In other words, that the spending in Afghanistan or in Iraq or for any kind of military hardware is a form of government intervention or government subsidy for corporations who get these contracts.
Absolutely, and they do pay and they lobby and they get, they're probably the military contractors and companies are more influential than oil companies in terms of Congress and the State Department.
Well, let's use this as a segue then to ask the three of you this question. And here we have a Congress that has been very, very reluctant to pass any meaningful relief for people who are foreclosed or threatened with foreclosure, for the unemployed, for all of those people who are suffering as a consequence of the economic crisis. And when you count the underemployed as well as the unemployed and those who have stopped looking for work, you're talking about millions, tens of millions of people. Why is it that Congress, Michael, just seems to always sign off on the military budget as if that's just an automatic payment operation? In other words, is there something about Congress that's hooked into the military-industrial complex, or is there a different motive?
Let me put a number on your intro there, Brian. When you're talking about the unemployed, the underemployed, and the just given up and not counted in the statistics anymore, I think we're looking at a number that's very close to 15%, if not higher than that, which is devastating to any economy. To answer your question directly, I think different people have their different perspectives and their different motivations. I know that one of the things on which almost everyone agrees is that we need an adequate defense for our country. That's one of the enumerated powers of government, responsibilities of government in our Constitution. And so everyone agrees that we need an adequate defense. Where we disagree, of course, is arguing over exactly what an adequate defense is and how we field it. We're going through a debate right now where last year we did sequester, or we passed legislation that will allow the sequestration of in excess of $600 billion out of the Pentagon's budget in the coming fiscal year. And there are some who want to play that hand the way it is, and there are some, most recently, of course, the Republican chairman of the House Budget Committee, Paul Ryan, who introduced a bill 2 days ago that would avoid that sequestration and make that $600 billion savings up in other ways. That bill has made it through the through the House or through the House committee. It's probably going to make it through the House, but it would be dead on arrival in the Senate. And furthermore would be vetoed by the president if it ever did get to his desk. So I think you've got a difference of opinion when you have limited resources. The conservative Republicans are saying, no, we have to live with the money that the government has now and figure out how to allocate our priorities. And the liberal Democrats would argue that, no, we have so many priorities and so little money that the answer is to increase the supply of money for the government to address all these problems. And those are ideologically held beliefs that are not going to be resolved before the next election, if then.
John, do you see it the same way?
Well, it's interesting you would ask the question today because I think Congress is passing a good piece of economic legislation that had the agreement of the administration and Republicans in Congress. The Senate is passing it after the House, the Jumpstart Our Business Startup Act, which loosens some of the regulatory barriers and really modernizes the securities laws for the internet age to help entrepreneurs raise more capital. But yeah, I think there are disagreements about ways to help on domestic policy. A lot more disagreements as far as whether it's spending spending programs versus tax cuts versus cutting regulation in general. What would be the best way to stimulate the economy or to create prospects for growth. Whereas there's a saying that partisanship ends at the water's edge, and everybody is for. I mean, you don't think no one really thinks the private sector can do national defense. That depends on how you define national defense. But people are always reluctant to see do anything that hurts the troops. So if it's in the names of funding the military, I think yes, that's where you see the agreement, because people don't want to be seen as against the individual troops, and they also, there is a respect for the president as far as how he conducts foreign affairs, more so than the disagreement on domestic affairs.
How do you see it, Ali?
Well, I think there is sort of this issue, a long, time issue in the United States, that when it comes to the military establishment and security establishment, it is like the holy grail, the holy cow. Nobody wants to take anything out of it. Unfortunately, it is now the largest part of the budget of the United States. And like you said, over 500 bases around the world that are unnecessarily, most of them are unnecessary. Why do the United States have a lot of troops in Europe or in many parts of the world? They're opening even new bases. So if I agree with the presidential candidate, Mr. Ron Paul, that this is where the U.S. can cut down its budget and deficit by reducing the number of these bases, by base closing. They did it during the Bush administration. They closed bases in the United States. They should close bases abroad, which cost more money and are more susceptible to corruption and more beneficial to military contractors. A military contractor in the United States who is in Afghanistan or in Iraq makes more money than many doctors. And this is unacceptable. A high schooler in Afghanistan who is a contractor, who's probably just wasting his time sleeping half his day, is making more money than doctors and lawyers. And that's unacceptable. For the U.S. to recover economically, it must address the massive spending on the military and the military-industrial complex.
Michael, when Dwight Eisenhower made that famous address, his last speech, his farewell address in 1961, right before Kennedy took office, he warned the country against the rise of what he called the military-industrial complex. He said it was a threat to democracy. It could devour limited but valuable resources. In his original speech, the one that wasn't the one he gave, he said it was a military-industrial congressional complex. And his aides took out the word congressional out of fear of offending the Congress. But doesn't it seem that way to you, that Congress is actually using military issues or national security simply as a talking point or as a pretext, but they too are sort of feeding at the trough? Don't they have to go out and then get the campaign donations from the same corporations that are basically on welfare from the U.S. government through the form of a military contract?
Well, Congress has always fed at the trough in terms of bringing home the bacon to the district. It's not a surprise that any particular military program, be it a weapons or a supply or an equipment or whatever it is program that might create jobs in their district, they would be persuaded that that would be a good thing and continue to vote for it. Both sides do that. We have the situation with the bases domestically that Ali was talking about, where we've begun to close some of our bases domestically that were redundant. And we have this convoluted plan called BRAC that forces the Congress to vote up or down on a series of closures that fortunately we've been able to get it through. The Congress has not overridden the BRAC Commission, the Base Realignment and Closing Commission. But it's not worth it. General Eisenhower, President Eisenhower was right. There is the seepage of that going on. It has resulted, I believe, in a very strong, good Defense Department and military services for the United States of America. Our troops are the best trained and the best equipped. But there are times when you look at the procurement process and the process of what we do in terms of, are we really giving the military what they ask for rather than what can be created in each congressional district? And there are many examples of doing it the wrong way.
John, let's go back to, and we're crossing back and forth between looking at U.S. military policy, foreign policy, and the economy. Now, you mentioned a new bill in Congress that you believe will be conducive to job growth or to
Yes.
start up some business. When Roosevelt was president during the mid-30s with the WPA, with the job creation programs, during that whole 6 or 7 year period, the government created probably somewhere between 10 and 11 million jobs. Unemployment was officially about 25%. Whether it worked or not is not what I'm asking. What I'm asking is, why do you think there's been such a reluctance by even a Democratic-led government, when the Democrats had the White House with a popular president when Obama came in, the House by a vast majority, a nearly veto-proof Senate? Why did the Democrats not go forward with a Rooseveltian-type jobs program? Is it because the political pendulum has shifted so far to the right?
I think so, and I mean, facts about the Rooseveltian program, really unemployment did not come down to where it was in the early 30s until we entered the war. In 1937, it spiked again, and the economy, we had a depression within a depression. So when the government spends money to create jobs, it whether for the military or for domestic programs, there's a crowding out effect where either through taxing or more borrowing, it takes money out of the private sector. So what we say at the Competitive Enterprise Institute is you don't need to subsidize or teach grass to grow. Remove the rocks, the regulatory rocks, and some of the other barriers, and you will see entrepreneurs starting up companies. And I think this is what there were some, bipartisan consensus agreements about some of the laws like Sarbanes-Oxley that frustrate capital raising just with accounting, red tape, and other things, and is keeping every type of company from green energy to oil company to small other types of energy and other companies from raising the capital they need to go public or to expand and create jobs.
But didn't we see and witness in the last 20 years a lot of deregulation? In other words, the Glass-Steagall bill was repealed. Meaning the ability of commercial banks to become investment banks or to bleed over, that the securitization of mortgages, the new financial instruments that led to huge speculative bubbles in the housing boom. I mean, the free market, less and less regulated, didn't it lead to the collapse of or near collapse of capitalism?
No, because I don't believe we had. Glass-Steagall was something that President Clinton was going to do. It was no other country had separated commercial and investment banking. No country in Europe did. So that was.
But when those banks went down, then the government was compelled to say they're too big to fail, and they.
Well, I don't. We were against a lot of those, and we also had the government subsidizing housing through Fannie and Freddie and other types of. It became it was bipartisan, but still you had the government subsidies saying the American dream is owning a home rather than starting a business, other things. And during the Bush years, that's when we had Sarbanes-Oxley that made it so, after Enron, that made it so hard to go public and really became, rewarded a lot of the accounting firms. I mean, I sometimes think there's a regulatory industrial complex with like accounting firms, have charged for more auditing services with Sarbanes-Oxley. This is something that President Obama, to his credit himself, has said, if regulations are outdated or not serving their purposes, I want them removed. So he and the Republicans in Congress agreed, and now this is going to be a lot of really help venture capitalists, emerging entrepreneurs, even people raising money online can have an easier task of doing that, of building their businesses and creating jobs.
John Berlow, Competitive Enterprise Institute, we're going to let you have the last word in the first segment. We'll be right back after a short break. Welcome back to the second segment of 2.5 Hours. I'm Brian Becker. We're joined in our Washington, D.C. studio by Michael Lane, Intelligent Strategies, John Berlow. He is the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I said it properly. Ali Ahmed from the Gulf Council. Ali, let's go back to the discussion of the economy. Here we are 5 years into what was the most brutal economic downturn, recession that called Western-style capitalism into question, at least in many quarters. Is there the beginning of an economic recovery? And what about all the human beings, it appears to be millions of them, who are not recovering, even if corporate profits are perhaps at an all-time high?
I don't think so far the administration or the ruling class in the U.S. have learned much. Just take a look at what they have done in the past few months. I mean, they have a desire to put sanctions on Iran, and what was the result? We are paying $1 more for gas a gallon today because of that sort of rush to an hectic policy. Today or yesterday, the Wall Street Journal had articles about the U.S. saying to Japan and EU that, okay, you don't have to put sanctions on Iran. You can still buy oil from Iran. Well, why did you do? Why didn't you think that is going to create more pressure, economic pressure on the EU and Japan and the United States?
In other words, the U.S. government, which says that Iran constitutes an existential threat, at the same time granted waivers to a number of countries that are in fact dependent on Iranian oil.
Of course, because when you make a policy, I mean, in the U.S. administration, not this one alone, have been making these policies and making these statements as if they are in some bar. Statements and policies have impact on the people of this country. When you place sanctions on Iran, oil prices are going up, and the Iranians have to sell less oil and make more money. But the U.S. average citizen is paying more at the pump because of this policy that is, you don't know what's going to happen. And tomorrow you're going to undo this policy. But already Mr. Smith and Mrs. Smith have suffered, and they are not going to the doctors because of it, or they are not able to
even if there were no sanctions on Iran, and even if oil prices hadn't gone up so dramatically, as you said, gasoline prices at the pump, which people are really feeling in the United States, you still have a situation where maybe 15% of the population was either unemployed or underemployed or stopped looking for work. Millions of families have been foreclosed or threatened with foreclosure. Large numbers of young people who graduated from college are so saddled with college debt and they can't pay the debt back because they can't get jobs. And then we have a situation where the government is saying, well, the recovery is here. But I'm just wondering about the changing shape of America, even regardless of the sort of congruences where there could be oil prices go up or down, even if they weren't going up. What's it look like for the American people, given the way the U.S. economic system is currently organized?
Just like I said about the issue of the military failure in Afghanistan, I say it about the policymakers, especially the foreign policymakers, the economic policymakers, that they are making policies with little regard to the average American, and that's why you have a 15% plus unemployment rate. That's the real unemployment rate, and you have an increase in energy costs and increase and higher inflation, because those people who make these decisions do not realize the impact of these decisions on the American citizens. They can do so much to reduce the pressure on the average American, and they have not done that. That's why I say it's a systematic problem. When the State Department officials attack Venezuela, for example, for no apparent reason, but the effect of that attack and straining of relations is what? More gas. I mean, the prices go up, and we pay more for energy and food and everything else.
Michael Lane, when President Obama came into office in January 2009, the U.S. was losing, I don't know the exact number, 700,000 jobs a month, something like that. Now, there has been an economic upturn of sorts, and 200,000 or 250,000 jobs per month are being created, not really enough to bring the unemployment rate way down. But one of the interesting things about the unemployment statistics is that nearly 1 out of 4 of the new hires are coming into what's called temp jobs, temporary jobs, meaning there's no benefits, there's no pensions. People, if they're sick, still won't be able to go to their doctor if they don't have health care insurance. Is that the sort of the big picture of where the American working families are going to low-paid temp jobs without the sort of traditional business or sort of social benefit policies that allowed people to think of themselves at least as upwardly mobile or middle class?
Well, we certainly hope not. I mean, at all costs, we hope not. Look, again, we get back to the philosophical difference between the president and his friends in Congress and his opponents in Congress. The president believes that the government has the long arm of steering the economy and trying to keep things steady and creating opportunities for people, while his opponents think the government doesn't have that at all, and in fact the government distorts the economy, and if the government would just step back, then the private sector would invest, create economic growth, create good high-paying jobs, and create wealth for people. It's a philosophical difference that the two are not going to see it each other's way. So it's up to the American people to make the decision in the next election whether or not they believe that government is the answer or whether they believe the private sector is the answer. I think people who listen to me know that I believe the private sector is the answer. You'll have investment if the government, and they need certainty. I mean, they still don't know. The government just announced last week that what we call Obamacare is going to cost twice what we thought it was going to cost. Now, that's going to have to be financed through tax money. We have the president still insisting that the Bush tax cuts be repealed. We have all this economic uncertainty out there, and all the money that's on the sidelines waiting to be invested, waiting to create economic growth, waiting to create economic wealth, and waiting to create jobs is sitting there because they're uncertain as to what the future is. We really need a decisive answer one way or the other in this November election to answer that question.
Okay, John, as an economist or someone focused on the economy, I don't know, maybe being an economist isn't considered a very honorable profession, but as someone who studies the economy, do you think that that's the reason the corporations that are flush with cash, have lots of money to invest with, but aren't investing? Is it because of uncertainty from government regulation or government intervention, or is it uncertainty because demand has been suppressed as a consequence of an economic recession? In other words, is it a traditional problem where people don't have the money to buy, and so investment isn't taking place?
I would lean more toward the uncertainty. I would think there's a saying by the French economist, and it is an honorable profession, Jean-Baptiste Say, in the 19th century, Say's law, supply creates its own demand. People didn't yell at Steve Jobs and say, hey, we want iPods and iPads. He created them, found a need, and filled a niche. Now, one of the interesting consensus points, and there is a lot of division, is on where the type of firms that do create jobs in the private sector. And the Kauffman Foundation in Kansas City, in a finding that was embraced by President Obama's Council on Jobs and Competitiveness, found that they are created by net job growth is from firms less than 5 years old of all sizes. And we've seen that firms in 5 years can become as big as Apple or as big as Microsoft, but that it's become harder for these firms with regulations that predate the Obama administration, such as Sarbanes-Oxley, where we're seeing a long-term decline in initial public offerings, and the absolute number of initial public offerings. Even in the recession year of 1991, there were 300. By 2006, after Sarbanes-Oxley was passed, we only had about 200, and now of course, in the recession, we're seeing less and less. And firms, it was the case that 90% of jobs a firm created was after they went public. Now, if companies are waiting until they're as big as Facebook, maybe $100 billion in market valuation to go public, it's that much longer before they create jobs. That's where the Jobs Act, the Jumpstart Our Business Startups Act, is really going to help by focusing on those firms.
Ali, the historic definition of a successful small business in America was you got out of it before you lost everything, and yet the image that's being presented by the Republican side and by others who are advocating free markets, deregulation, is that small business drives the economy. They're the big job creators, and the government just has to get off their back in order to make that happen. Is that the way you see it?
Well, I think that's part of the solution. That obviously the government cannot hire everyone. So, and their job is not to force down the throat of people what to do. You should give them sufficient freedom. However, of course, regulations are also important. They should not be intrusive regulations. But the United States, the government has been sucking a large part of the American wealth and disposing of it for mostly useless projects. So that's why there should be an active and an honest and an aggressive attempt on cutting the United States government budget, closing a lot of the agencies that are useless and redundant. Same thing, especially in the military field, because there is so much money being spent on the military expansion that is not necessary, and the base closing. I mean, I just around here there is this Navy research base here on the Potomac here, and it's useless because if you why don't you move that somewhere else where you can sell this land for billions of dollars for private investors. So there is a lot to be done, but it needs honest Congress and an honest president.
I want to just stay for a minute or two more on the economy, Michael. The picture that we're seeing is one of a slight increase, a pickup in economic activity, but it's rooted in a global environment. When the U.S. economy, when the banks crashed in September 2008, that dragged the world economy, or most of it, into a recession and crisis. Then we had Europe, and it appeared that Europe's sovereign debt crisis could trigger another wave of recession. And just recently, the Greek debt agreement was developed, became the rule. The private investors took a big haircut, maybe losing 75% of their investment. But as a result, for the moment, Greece has stabilized. But then you have, on the other side of the world, China starting to appear to be a contracting economy, or not contracting, but its growth rate slowing substantially. And should that happen, won't that have a profound impact not only on the people in China, but also on the U.S. economy? And is there anything that any sovereign government can do about these kind of global shifts of either economic expansion or contraction or of money flows?
To answer the last part first, I don't think there's anything any government can do about the global. I mean, it's just not big enough. We talk about whether or not the government has enough money just to impact a stimulus plan in the United States, and we put 800 and some odd billion into that, and some people would argue that it cushioned the blow. Others would say it was just money wasted. But when you talk about the global economy, there's just not enough money in existence to impact that. So to a certain extent, you need to let it ride. Look, our recovery has been sluggish. I think we all agree the numbers technically show that the recession is over. But the recovery is not robust. The recovery is not energetic. How do we get a robust, energetic recovery to accomplish, as you pointed out, job creation that actually brings down the unemployment rate and instead of one that just sort of lets us mark time? The answer, in part, is exports. And exports are not going to pick up dramatically until the world economy picks up. So we do have an interest in seeing Greece not go down the tubes and the European Union, the Eurozone, not go down the tubes as a result of it. I'm glad to see that we didn't participate in it as an equal partner, equal equity partner in making that all happen. It was Europe's responsibility to do that. But it's going to be slow for multiple reasons. Significantly, one of which is our domestic policies that don't provide pro-growth incentives to business, and the other one is the world economy. They don't, if we solve one, we'll have better growth. We really want to solve both, but solving one would be better than solving none, and we're sitting here at square zero.
John, again, as an economist, a noble profession, as you say, what would allow the United States to really become a major new factor, an improved situation for its own exports? The United States manufacturing base since the early 1970s has been steadily contracting. And partly because U.S. corporations can determine we can pay workers lower wages in Mexico or Singapore or somewhere else. And that's what it's all about. It's about bottom line profits for the corporations and for the investors. Whether or not the destruction of industrial infrastructure in towns and cities has a devastating impact or not, doesn't the U.S. sort of have organic structural problem in terms of developing an export base again?
Well, I don't. I think the focus should be, and I'm usually don't. I'm not a fan of industrial policy. I think that hadn't worked. It seemed to be working for some time in Japan, but then directing to certain industries was one of the things that caused their implosion in the 90s. But I think focusing on and not exclusive focusing on the firms that are the net job creators, which are, according to the Kauffman Foundation, the President's Council on Jobs and Competitiveness, not just small businesses, but the new firms, the firms less than 5 years old, and also making it easier for them to raise capital and go public, and also just our tax structure. We now have the highest overall. Now there are a lot of loopholes within the policy, but that's part of the problem is that the absolute rate being 35% is so high. It's going to be, I think in April, it's going to be higher than Japan's, and then among the highest in the world,
no,
and
the highest in the
world. The highest in the world, and then also where you can, if you bring money back home, if you repatriate it, you face that that 35% tax penalty. So that really sort of traps money abroad, and from companies that are successful exporters, that are successful abroad, from bringing in and building new manufacturing or new types of enterprises here. So our tax and regulatory structure really could use an overhaul.
John, I'd be interested. Did your organization have a position on the reauthorization of the Export-Import Bank?
Yes, we were against it.
Okay.
We think we would like to see the money for the Ex-Im Bank directed to certain industries as far as tax relief for all industries. We were just generally against all types of like say government subsidies, either for individuals or for big corporations. So
I
yes,
think one of the biggest export that the United States government, the policymakers, even think tanks have not even paid attention to is the American person. Imagine if there are millions of Americans who go and travel and live abroad, make money and start businesses abroad. I mean, that is one of the biggest exports and the better exports. And many people don't know that it is the movies and software that's making money for the United States more than anything else. But we have to focus on the Americans. I think that in this country's history, there was the gold rush where millions, maybe hundreds of thousands of people went to California to try to make a living. Now it's probably Africa or Asia or China that this is your gold rush now. Go east, young man, and make money there, and then this will help cut down on the unemployment rate and will make money for this country and will keep it afloat. Otherwise, really, the shape of the economics has changed. It's not the time of 1930 or 40s. Now you have China. Russia is going to be one of the economic tigers that's going to take off very soon because they have the oil, they have the energy, and their relationship with Europe. Europe is depending on them. They're making enough money. They're building their structures, and they are going to be an economic power, not only a military power.
Let's talk about the intersection of economic policy for the United States as relates to the rest of the world, and sort of the military foreign policy, because you have the country, in addition to the countries you've mentioned, there's Indonesia,
India,
which
Brazil.
is taking off, and yet, and of course China. But here you have the United States, in the case of China, for instance, building sort of an Asian military alliance with non-Chinese countries. The Chinese view that as a point of strategic competition with China for influence in the Pacific. President Obama in Australia just said that the U.S. was tilting towards Asia in terms of its preoccupation of its foreign policy. In the case of Iran, you have the sanctions, which India doesn't want to go along with the sanctions on Iranian oil, and is working out barter agreements and even the use of gold in order to acquire Iranian oil, short of having to use dollars, U.S. hard currency. Does the U.S. sort of position as the great empire, the great sort of, I would say, bully in the world, also have a negative impact in terms of its ability to have a kind of constructive, regionally based economic cooperation with some of these strongly emerging economies? And you could say the same about Latin America, for instance, with Brazil, Venezuela, etc.
Yeah, there is this obsession, the policies of obsession. I mean, Cuba, for example, What is the use of not selling Cuba food and planes, or selling Iran civilian airliners? You make money. I mean, you're not going to make that government any stronger by selling them civilian airliners.
So what accounts for it?
I mean, it's just that the sort of that irrational policy that is you're shooting your own self in the face by applying sanctions, by reducing the amount of oil available in the international market, and then you make that the same country more money this way, selling less oil, and you make the average American suffer more at the pump and at the end of the month. It's irrational.
In the case of Cuba, the Cubans are suffering because they're embargoed. They have to go thousands of miles to get an aspirin.
But at the same time, you know, the regime is still there 50 years later.
Yeah,
these are irrational policies.
So let's just talk about that, because that seems irrational to me too, illogical. Certainly, you can't make the case that Cuba represents a national security threat to the people of the United States. You might have been able to make that argument in 1961, but not now. And yet we see U.S. policy, and I want to ask you about this specifically, when it comes to Syria, when it comes to Iran, when it comes to Cuba, when it comes to China, even when it comes to Russia, it seems as though the United States has the position that any country that has emerged as an independent government, either because of an anti-colonial
That's the key word,
struggle,
independence.
yeah, I mean, is that, in other words, sort of like an organic tendency to snuff out independent governments, even if it doesn't make logical economic sense? I mean, is there a psychological factor of the United States sort of inheriting the tradition of European colonialism? We must beat down independent governments?
I don't think it goes quite that flagrantly. I think that you always want to be influential in your
But why,
in your
let's say
spheres of influence.
Syria and Libya must be overthrown, but Saudi Arabia, a terrible undemocratic government, is fine. Like, why? What accounts for it?
Well, regrettably, Saudi Arabia is not fine. You know, there are people who do accept the fact that they may be what's the word? Dictators, but there are friendly dictators, and so therefore we'll tolerate them. You know, first and foremost, we're looking for stability.
And they're not an independent government. That was my point.
Right. First and foremost, we're looking for stability. Secondly, we're looking for friends. And you know, we treat each one. First of all, you're going to have inconsistency from administration to administration, and most inexplicably, in this administration, you have inconsistency from country to country. So you don't really know what, particularly as you look through the Arab Spring and country by country, how the Obama administration treated each of those circumstances entirely differently, and there didn't seem to be any underlying consistent philosophy or thought as to how they were going to do it. Now we face Syria. What are we going to do? We don't even have a policy. That's a new one. We've had a policy on all the other ones. On Syria, our policy is we'll stand back and we'll tell Assad he has to go, but we do nothing about it.
Well, they supported the violent revolutions. Libya, they supported it. Even
with military intervention.
With military, and there were special forces in American special forces in Libya on the ground way before even the campaign started. Same thing with Syria. They have supported it. But the peaceful revolutions in Yemen and in Bahrain, the U.S. not only took, they didn't take the sort of the neutral, they took an aggressive position against the revolution in Bahrain and in Yemen, and
But is it a question that the policy is determined by the U.S. supports violent revolutions and not peaceful revolutions?
It's independence.
Or, yeah, that's what I want to get at, because Syria has, from time to time, and in important times, collaborated with the United States. Certainly the first Gulf War, certainly with the rendition of people back to Syria who were tortured as part of the CIA's secret ops program. But Syria is an independent government.
Yes.
And Libya, while Gaddafi in the last years collaborated with the U.S. and Britain, he was an independent government. They didn't like him from the beginning. They tried to assassinate him in 1986. In the case of Yemen, in the case of Mubarak in Egypt, in the case of the Saudi royal family, in the case of the Bahrain royal family, where the Fifth Fleet is stationed, you have entities that were neither independent of the U.S. and, in fact, were many people saw as an extension of American power.
I mean, I don't think it's the case that they're independent, that we oppose them because they're independent. I mean, we have a lot of constructive relationships with. I don't think anyone would say India is not independent, and we have a very constructive constructive relationship with them. I mean, I think there are serious human rights concerns about, if not military concerns about Cuba and Castro's holding of political prisoners, other things, persecution of gays, other things in Cuba. I don't think the embargo's the way, but I mean, I can see where human rights, others concerns, and
so you
even,
think human rights is driving U.S. policy towards Cuba?
I think it's one of the big motivations.
What about Saudi Arabia? What about Saudi Arabia? Why? I mean, Saudi Arabia's position on all the things that you mentioned is 100 times worse than Cuba.
That's true. Compare Saudi Arabia and
Cuba. It's an indisputable fact. No?
I actually, it would depend on what you would compare. But yeah, I mean, there are different strategies for. I mean, Saudi Arabia having resources and being in that region is certainly a part of it. But I think there are. I think also for Cuban Americans here, and including some in Congress, that is a concern, and that's an understandable concern. But I mean,
I disagree completely because when it came to Saudi Arabia, one of the things I did, I worked on textbook reports on Saudi Arabia, and where they called for the annihilation of the Jewish people from this earth. Yet, and we know Jewish Americans have influence in Congress. Yet, this small thing, as the Saudi education system has not changed in 10 years, just shows you it has nothing to do with the Cuban Americans.
It's politically convenient for us to get along with the House of Saud,
yes.
And it's not politically convenient for us to get along with the House of Castro.
Exactly.
I mean, that's the bottom line.
Well, and it's also
what makes it
for a balance
though?
in the region, things like that, and realpolitik in the Middle East, all that. That maybe there may be the view that it's the least worst.
Go ahead, Ali.
And I think it's really, again, I say it is a systematic deficiency that. If a relationship with Cuba would make America stronger, would make it much more able to conduct policy, embracing the Cuban government and opening a relationship with it will improve the situation of human rights there and will make Cuba closer to the United States. But they are not doing that. In terms of Saudi Arabia, there is a lot of things, and I've written several reports on that they could have done that would have reduced the security threats to the United States itself through the textbooks issue and radicalization issue that the Saudi government is supporting. It's the fact that there were at least 2,000 Saudi suicide bombers in Iraq is a result of the Saudi government policy and continued policy that has never been addressed by the United States government. You are talking about a government who is killing U.S. soldiers through its policy, but they were never held accountable or scrutinized even for it. And that tells you that there is a systematic problem.
In the last 10 seconds, I'm going to give you the final word. In the last 10 seconds, why? What's the reason?
Because there is a lot of corrupt politicians in Washington.
Bought and paid for by the Saudis? Or
Saudis and other governments. That's why China gets blamed and Saudi Arabia doesn't get blamed for the same thing, because Chinese do not pay U.S.
I think it's a little more than that.
You have 3 seconds.
Saudi Arabia brings stability. We like that. It's in our interest.
China brings stability as well.
That's going to wrap it up. Michael Lane, John Berlow, Ali Ahmad, I'm Brian Becker. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.